There are a lot of Democratic presidential candidates already, and there are a lot of ways to gauge who is making progress amongst them. This time on Poll Hub, CNN Politics senior writer and analyst Harry Enton is here to help us figure it all out. And we think if Donald Trump gave him a nickname, it might be Poll Man. We'll take your suggestions after you listen to this episode. So let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And he is Harry Enton. Hi, Harry. Welcome back.
I believe I'm actually supposed to go as Poll Man, so I'm confused now.
No, we'll call you Poll Man. We're just making that up, but we figure if you get a nickname from Donald Trump, you're somebody big. So, who knows? We figured we'd give
There's
you
a
one.
Political reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer whose last name was Pollman.
Was.
So it might still be.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Anyway, Harry, welcome. We're here to talk about polling because that's what you do, that's what we do, and 2020 has gotten started very early. We kind of said it in the beginning. There are a lot of candidates already running, but there are a lot of ways to gauge them. We're looking at money, we're looking at polls, we're looking at social media interest. How are you sorting through all this?
Yeah, I mean, look, as you said, it's still very, very early, and there are a lot of different ways to gauge it. So number one, obviously we are looking at the polls. I think that polls are important, but we have to recognize it's still very early. But you'd rather be ahead than behind at this point. Second way we're looking is endorsements. Candidates historically who've gotten the lion's share of endorsements tend to do particularly well in primaries. No one has the lion's share of endorsements so far. We're also looking at money raised. Candidates who raise more money than not tend to do better than those who don't. And, we're also looking at media mentions, whether that be, Google searches or whether that be on television. The candidates who tend to have their names in the news more often tend to do better. And when you take all those together, I think you get an understanding that this race is generally wide open, although perhaps there are some people who have a little better shot than others.
What is the polling telling you so far about any lanes that these people are occupying? I guess that's the word that's going to become overused pretty soon, but it hasn't been yet.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that you're exactly right. Lane can sometimes lead you astray because in a primary, the difference between a liberal and a conservative candidate isn't necessarily as large as it is in a general election. But I will say that so far what we do see is someone like Joe Biden is doing particularly well among older voters, those over the age of 50. He's also doing better among the moderate and conservative Democrats, while Bernie Sanders is doing particularly well among younger voters. And indeed, if you were basically to chart their support, you'd basically have an X, whereby Biden does worse with the younger voters, best with the older voters, okay in the middle, while Sanders does best with younger voters, okay in the middle, and then really poorly with older voters.
The last couple of presidential cycles, we've seen these major and dramatic changes in how social media has affected the debate and the dialogue. In 2008, we had the Obama team, using Facebook to target voters, and now that seems so last century. Put your, look into the crystal ball, and how is social media going to be different this time and impact the race, or maybe not impact the race?
I think one way in which it's already different is that you have these candidates who you might not otherwise have ever heard from in the olden days, like an Andrew Yang, who's, a businessman who decided that I'm going to run for president and was able to use Twitter and social media more generally speaking to build up so many donations that at this point, at least, he qualifies for the first presidential debate. I think it helps to expand the field out and makes it more difficult to narrow the field. So that's one thing. But, the other way that I think is important also to point out is that while social media can broaden it out and can help us see candidates that we might not otherwise see, there are plenty of people who aren't on social media. And so those voters in particular tend to be older voters, those who are a little less engaged. And so I think it's very important to recognize that their vote counts just as much as those on social media.
How much risk is there that we get into a trap of saying, following the models of the past when we're looking at these candidates? Because when I hear, well, historically candidates do well that have more money, or candidates do well that have the most endorsements. I'm thinking, well, yeah, we're talking about a history that has not existed in the last 2 cycles. We had a Republican cycle with 20-some-odd candidates. We have a Democratic cycle with 20-some-odd candidates, neither of which has ever happened before. So are we at risk here of following models that aren't relevant anymore?
I think so. I mean, and that's why I think it's so important not to just have a point prediction, right? It's important to recognize the margin of error, to recognize the small sample size that we have. We're only looking back at primaries since 1972, and that's even if you include the Republican and Democratic sides, you still have a small sample size. Only looking at the Democrats, you have a really small sample size. And so I think what's important to recognize is we can say, hey, this candidate we believe has a better chance of winning than this one, but at this point, there are a lot of candidates who still have a greater than 1% chance of winning the nomination.
Jay started talking a little bit about comparisons to the GOP contest in 2016. Aside from this huge field, which is what happened in 2016 for the Republicans, are we about to see Democrats, perhaps the big name ones, maybe a Biden or a Sanders, maybe taking this wire to wire, unlike what the GOP did last time? Or is it really set for maybe a woman, perhaps, who may ride that mobilization into the front of the pack? Now, I know it's early to say, but what's your gut?
I mean, look, one of the things that should be pointed out is that, yes, it was the case that, say, Jeb Bush was leading in the polls in April of 2015. But when Donald Trump entered, at the time he was a month into the race, he was ahead, and he never relinquished that lead. I think that in that particular way, I think it's important to recognize that polls can still be a guiding light for us, and that more times than not, the person who has led in the early polls has actually gone on to win the nomination. I know that's difficult to believe. It's around 50-50, but slightly more times than not, the person ahead has gone ahead and won the nomination. So I think that we should pay attention to the polls, because even if a lot of things have changed, right, the polls can definitely help us out. But in terms of going wire to wire, look, I think the one thing you should keep in mind is right now, the person leading in the polls is Joe Biden, but at the same time, the number one quality that voters don't necessarily want in a Democratic candidate, at least among Democrats, is a candidate who's over the age of 75. So you have to take those two conflicting pieces of information and try and form a thesis from it, and I'm not necessarily sure you'll be able to form a clean one from it.
Then also, Bernie doesn't exactly solve that problem.
No.
He's in second.
I must say, I always thought that when I reached the ripe old age that I currently am, I would be older than most of the candidates running. And I gotta say, this thing is kind of surprising because, 70 seems to be the entering.
The new 50.
The new 50, yeah. Well, you talked to a little bit earlier about, candidates being ahead in the polls or not, and it's nicer to be ahead than behind. And I guess people also say, well, the early polls are only name recognition. But I guess by analogy, you would say it's better to be known than not known. So these things are all potential guides. I'm just tossing that out for you.
I think that they are guides, but more than that, keep in mind that, it's not just the fact that Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are better known. If you're better known and disliked, it won't get you anywhere. They're well known and they're well liked.
Yeah, true.
And more than that, look, I think we can say something from the fact that Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are about as well known as each other, and yet Joe Biden, at least in the national polls, is up about 10 points on Bernie Sanders. I think that's useful. I think the fact that Elizabeth Warren is better known than any other candidate except for Biden and Sanders, and yet she's struggling in the polls with Beto O'Rourke and Kamala Harris ahead of her, and the fact that Pete Buttigieg is doing so well despite the fact that he only has about 50% name recognition. I think you can take those and form solid theses about who's stronger and weaker at this point, but still recognize that we're nearly a year away.
In 2016, the Republicans were looking for change. If you held an office, that was actually held against you. What do you think the Democrats, and I know it's hard to draw a circle around a group again that's very diverse, but what do you see the Democrats looking for in this crowd?
I think, in all honesty, the simple answer to that question is more so than at any point in the last 20 years, Democrats want someone who can defeat the opposition party's candidate. And that goes above, a certain demographic that they might meet, whether it be a white man or a black woman or a woman more generally speaking. And so I think sometimes we overplay that. I will say, however, that if you're looking at the numbers, it does not seem that Democrats are as, let's say, fixed eyes on getting an outsider as, say, the Republicans were in 2015. So, I'm a little cautious to say anything. But, at this point, again, just going back, the fact that Democrats are choosing, at least right now, two candidates in the top two, Biden and Sanders, who are both over the age of 75, despite the fact that polls indicate that voters don't necessarily want that. They're not too enthusiastic about that, I think is a warning sign to recognize it's still very, very early.
And also that they come from different segments of the party as well. So you think the Democrats will rise above ideology and coalesce this time? That's always been a hard thing for them to do in the past.
What I will say is I think Democrats took a lesson to heart from 2016, and what you see is a much more wide open process. And you can see it just with the debates, right? Whereby it's, the DNC isn't coming in and declaring, this person's in and this person's out. What they've said is you've got to be at X level in the polls. You have to have X level of donations made to your campaign. And that's how we're going to fit the criteria for who gets in. And I think if you have that, then I think at the end of the day, whoever the nominee is, you have a better chance of coalescing and saying, hey, this was a quote-unquote fair process, or at least more people are likely to believe that than perhaps did last time.
It's kind of striking to me that in 2016, the establishment Democratic candidate was Hillary Clinton. And in 2020, the establishment candidates are Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden right now. All of these candidates share the fact that they are older, they've been through the cycle, they're not the new young thing. Is that all they share, or do they also share perhaps that Achilles heel of being the establishment pick in a party that, despite what we just talked about, wanting to beat Trump more than anything else, still seems to have a real kind of deep-seated feeling for finding the outsider who can win, something Republicans picked up on in 2016 and turned it to their own advantage?
I think the fact that they all came in with strong name recognition, I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that they're well known to the public. They are people who not just activists know and adore, right? Bernie Sanders built up that name ID back in 2016 that he's able now to use in 2020. So voters are comfortable with him. I think that, there's going to be a subset, certainly, of the Democratic electorate that wants an outsider, who wants a fresh voice, who wants someone who inspires them. I think that's part of the reason why you've seen a Pete Buttigieg kind of climb up in the polls. But at the end of the day, I recognize that this primary is going to be determined by voters who, at this particular point, are not tuned in necessarily, and they are going to go with someone that they feel more comfortable and safe with.
Well, I think you're so right in not overanalyzing every kernel at this point, because it is such a crowd, and we're almost done with the entry into the race. Maybe a few more coming. The first big event, I guess, is going to be coming around the corner with the first set of debates. What would you advise the candidates, particularly the so-called second tier, not these front runners we've been talking about, but how are you going to break out of the pack?
Well, how are the front runners going to break out?
That's true also.
I don't think there's a distinction in this case. You got 20 people running. How do you break out? If you're not Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, how do you rise above it?
I think at the end of the day, the one thing, again, that voters really, really want is a candidate that they have a belief can differentiate themselves from Donald Trump and beat him in the general election. Obviously, there is going to be this inclination, perhaps, to go after the front runners, but I think that you can save that towards the latter part of the campaign. I think at this point, if you are not well known, recognize that this is your chance before a national audience to become well known, and you have to figure out something that differentiates yourself from the pack in a good way. And that, I think, is the key differentiation, because you're going to have all these candidates running who are all going to sound very, very similar. Figure out a message that helps you separate yourselves out from the field. I know that's kind of broad, but I think that, at least at this particular point, that's sort of the thing you want to do.
But it may be the demography also. It could be the gender, it could be the race, it could be something else that can provide that boost, I guess.
Well, sure. I think you want to create your own lane, right? That's what you want. You want your own own lane, your own niche within the Democratic electorate, because at the end of the day, nomination processes are momentum builders, right? You get a point to get a second point to get a third, and the whole thing kind of snowballs. If you're able to figure out a group that you really do connect with, then it seems to me that you can then snowball that and to connect with the larger Democratic electorate.
You recently tweeted about money, and you looked at the money raised in the cycle so far. Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, and Pete Buttigieg are in the lead, and the combined total of what they've raised in this first quarter is less than what Hillary Clinton raised in similar. It's actually Q2 of 2015, so a similar place in the cycle. So does money actually mean as much as it has in the past? And the reason I ask is because your network, CNN, I think, could be credited with, at least in part, giving Pete Buttigieg, a place at the discussion table by having that great town hall. I mean, he was widely seen as a breakout candidate from that. You guys have been doing town halls with all of these candidates. How much does that obviate the need for them to raise boatloads of money to make a move in the polls?
Yeah, so I look at money in two ways. The first way I look at money is it's a telltale sign for analysts such as myself, right? I don't think it's too much of a surprise that the candidates who have raised the most amount of money so far tend to be the candidates that are highest in the polls. But how it helps the candidates in particular isn't necessarily right now, right? You're not going to have candidates that are putting ads on the air, but it does help them build organizations in the early states. And more than that, the ability to continue to raise money is important once the primary season gets underway. There won't be town halls for these candidates every 2 minutes, but to be able to go in and say that, let's say there are 8 or 10 primaries or caucuses in a single day, to be able to put ads on in all of those states, to build the organizations in all those states, to get that little extra percent out of each and every state. We saw, for instance, in 1992, one of the reasons that Bill Clinton was able to win that primary was because he raised so much money. He raised so much money, and he was able to outlast Paul Zongas.
Yeah. One of the things also, you're trying to look down, prospectively at what might be occurring. And I already have revised my initial take was that there's so many Democrats, they're going to have a home court advantage, and that's going to negate some of the early primaries. And yet it doesn't look like, from some of the early polls, particularly in Massachusetts, where Elizabeth Harris is not doing well.
Elizabeth Warren,
I'm sorry, is not doing well. In New York, we've asked about Kirsten Gillibrand, and she's not capitalizing on that home court advantage. What's your take on? I mean, there's almost a Democratic candidate from every major state, and yet it doesn't maybe going to make all that much of a difference.
I don't think it necessarily makes a difference in who does well where, although obviously there's still time to come. I do think it makes a difference insofar as different factions of the Democratic Party are being represented in this field. But yeah, I think it is important to note that some of these candidates aren't doing particularly well in their home states. And the reason I think it's important to note that is there are a lot of people who are saying these early leads for some of these candidates are due to name ID. But come on, folks, Elizabeth Warren just won a re-election of the Senate in Massachusetts in 2018. She has universal name ID in that state. So the fact that she's running third behind Sanders and Biden, that's not a good sign. Or go to New York, as you mentioned. Kirsten Gillibrand just won re-election in 2018. Yet her favorable ratings are well below both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Or obviously in New York, Bill de Blasio is not polling particularly well. So if he has his sights set on the presidency, that to me is a major warning sign.
How about the scandals? How do you think that is going to play down the road in this primary season? Has Trump lowered the bar, or Democrats have higher have higher expectations? And I was
Maybe
going
not higher
to say
standards,
lower tolerance for
Yeah.
these kinds of things.
Interesting.
I'll say this. I'll just use Al Franken as an example, right? It is true. It's 100% true that Democrats were able to get him out of the Senate, essentially forced him out of the Senate for the allegations that were made against him. But it is also the case that if you look at the polling from that state, that only a minority of Democrats actually believe those charges against Al Franken, and a majority of them did not want him to resign. So I think when you have a candidate that you like, you tend to find a way to excuse perhaps their indiscretions, while if there's a candidate you don't like, then you just use those faults against them, and it's just a reason to hate them even more.
Well, we're going to go, but before we do, any chance that we can have a Subway Series, Yankees-Mets, and I know who you're going to be rooting for, you know who I'm going to be rooting for, and if there is, maybe we can go to a ball game and really hack it up.
You know, I would say, of course, there's a shot at it, just as there's a shot for most of the Democrats in the field so far. If there is a Subway Series, Lee, I will definitely go with you. But just know this. I wish nothing but 14-inning games played in rain for the New York Yankees.
And I wish nothing but Diet Cream soda for you.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Well, Harry, thanks so much for coming on and walking us through all this. There's a lot to talk about, and sometimes we do wonder if we're talking too much about 2020, but everybody else seems to be too. It doesn't seem to just be the pollsters and the media pundits. I can't go any place without people talking about it. And this is an engaged and energized electorate on both sides, it seems like. So I think we have a lot to talk about and a lot to watch going forward. And we'll be watching you on CNN as you lay some of this out.
Thanks so much. And you know what? I say it's never too early. We should have fun. We should have fun. Some things should be fun. Discussing politics at times should be fun. Shalom, everybody.
Shalom, Harry.
That will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Thank you, Mary Griffith, our executive producer, and thank you, Kenny Marples, our editor.
Yeah, you're going to find this a piece of cake. We took Harry wire to wire on this one, Kenny. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University, who always provide us the ability to look back at time at survey questions and trend data. And that's the kind of stuff that all of us are using to kind of like form opinions about what's going on in the Democratic race right now.
In 2020, looking way back. Send your questions, if you've got them, and we like to answer them, to pollhub@marist.edu. You can also reach us on social media. Often the best way to reach us, because we have lots of folks following us there, at Marist Poll on Twitter or Marist Poll on Facebook. Lee and I are both on Twitter as well, so you can follow us there if you want. We get into the weeds sometimes, but it's kind of fun. And don't forget to subscribe. And again, thanks to our poll man, Harry, for coming on again. We'll see you next week.